Most people, when they think of Christmas, they think of camels, swaddling clothes, and a manger. But I think of an automobile assembly plant. One year, I visited my sister in Indiana, and we toured the Toyota assembly plant in Princeton, Indiana, and watched them assemble cars, and it was an eye-opener. Now, I had always thought that Toyota would just guess how many cars they needed to make, and they'd make that many. If they decided to make blue cars one day, they'd make maybe 2,000 or 3,000, and then they'd switch to some other color. But of course, that's not the way they do it. All over America, people walk into dealerships, they look around, they kick some tires, and they order a car. A certain model with specific equipment, a color, the roof, the transmission, the interior, and dealers, they will fill out a little computer card, and then the order is placed with Toyota. Now, in one city, they'll make the correct transmission. In another city, they will make the engines. In another, the mirrors. In fact, all these cities, they start feeding their products towards the assembly plant. And there at the assembly plant, there's a person who, say, puts on steering wheels. The car comes down the lines, and when a blue car comes, you can bet there's not a red steering wheel to put on it. At exactly the right time, the blue steering wheel, it's there. The assembly worker reaches out and grabs one and sticks it on. That's what happens with each part. The mirror, the engine, the seat covers, every part shows up precisely at the right instant. When I visited the plant, I thought of this. Now, if a human being is capable of designing such an ingenious system to bring thousands of events and people together with precision timing just to make a car, well, imagine what God can do in preparing for his visit to earth. And that's something that I also think of at Christmas. The number of events that God put together to make Christmas happen. Have you ever thought of the number of events that God put together to make Christmas happen? Well, the Apostle Paul expressed it this way in today's reading. But when the set time had fully come, God sent forth his Son. When the set time had fully come. I also like how another translation expresses this passage. It uses the phrase, in the fullness of time. Not just in time, but in its fullness. Jesus was born in the fullness of time. Exactly on schedule. Precisely as it could have been, and at no better time would it occur, when all the things would fit perfectly together. And then it was into that mesh of his coming. A woman got pregnant, a baby began to be formed, and then you wrap this gift in history. Now, what might have been on Paul's mind when he wrote and when he recognized this fullness of time that's associated with the Messiah's birth? What is the fullness of time? And how are we to understand it? And how does that impact us as we move forward from Christmas 2020? Well, first, the fullness of time would require a number of things, I would think. It would require a language that people can use to convey the message. And if you look at history, they didn't have one since Babel. The world was filled with multiple languages. There essentially was no linguistic rifle that could be shot from one place and understood in another. It was really a collage. And so in history, there came along a man who was Alexander the Great, who formulated a language that became known as Koine Greek. In theological school, you usually have to pick a language, Greek or Hebrew, Koine Greek, and I took Koine Greek because it was a precise language that was in place. It's a miracle that that language was in place that would put together that which would otherwise be abstruse or clearly understood in printed form for the world to read. So in the fullness of time, of all times in human history, this Koine Greek, the common language, was established. So in the fullness of time, there was a language. Well, if you've got language and you've got a message to convey, you need to be able to get the message out. You need roads to travel on to get the message out. And again, in this fullness of time, history tells us Rome built roads. It was the first superhighway. It was a way they communicated, kind of like our online highway, but it was a road. They had paved roads for the very first time. Thanks to Rome, that's the way God works, even on a highway. Paved roads that tie east with west. That's part of the fullness of time, isn't it? But what about the politics of those days? Well, you had a very unusual situation. You had a census out of the blue that required a man who found his roots down in Bethlehem to go literally and physically to sign that census back to his country seat. And it just so happened that this man had been engaged to this woman, and they made the trek down to Bethlehem right about the time of her term. That's how you wrap an indescribable gift. You wrap him in undeniable history. In fact, history has been called his story. So what was his story? What was that message that in the fullness of time was able to be shared, that is still at the cornerstone of what we are about as Christ followers today? First, there is what Jesus taught about how to live. I find it interesting that Jesus, he never gave any laws. He never gave a law, but he did teach, and he lived by some great principles which are both timely and timeless. For example, Palestine was a part of a great empire, and the majority of whose population, they were slaves. It is intriguing that Jesus never spoke a word against slavery, but he did say this. He said, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. It would kind of put an end to slavery, wouldn't it? It's found in Matthew's gospel. And Jesus, he was not a legislator. He did not erect a body of rules and regulations, but he did say this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He did not insist that his disciples should all think alike or even act alike. But he did insist that they should be about one thing. It is the one command that Jesus gave us. He said, a new command I give you: love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. That was his command, not just his suggestion. And as Christ followers, I really want to be attentive to what was important to Jesus that he said we need to be about. He was no scholar, yet he challenges thoughts for centuries. He was no physician, yet in his name a mighty ministry of healing has been inspired. He was no moralist, yet he stands supreme in the moral sphere. And he was no social reformer. He was about the soul, yet he creates a social conscience that furnishes the dynamic motive really for all great social movements in history. More than what he taught about how to live was what he did and what he is. And that's why we are here. It's why you are watching what he was really about. That God, in Jesus the Christ, revealed the character of God. God is the God who sent Jesus. That God is love. Jesus not only showed us that the nature of God was love, but he also showed us that we are important in God's eyes. In fact, we are the reason for Christmas. I know it's popular to say, and there is an element of truth in that Jesus is the reason for the season. But my friends, I'm not sure Jesus would say that. I think he would say, we are the reason for the season. In John's Gospel it says, for God so loved the world, he gave. So Christmas began in the heart of God. And it is complete only when it reaches the heart of God's people. Elsewhere, the Apostle Paul put it together and expressed it so well and so succinctly. He wrote in Ephesians, he said, in him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. For God so loved the world in the fullness of time. Amen.